What's something your parents believe that you don't?
Picture this. It's a sticky summer afternoon in our family's old Iowa farmhouse, the kind where the air hums with cicadas and the weight of unspoken grudges hangs heavier than the humidity. And there I am, Emily Hargrove, squeezed into a creaky wooden chair beside my smug brother Tom, both of us waiting for grandfather's lawyer to crack open that sealed envelope that could rewrite our lives forever, because Dad's multi-million-dollar agribusiness has always been Tom's playground. But grandfather's will feels like the wild card nobody saw coming, and as the lawyer clears his throat, I can already see Tom's smirk widening, ready to claim his throne while I'm left with dust and memories. I never thought grandfather's funeral would kick off a family feud that'd linger like the smell of fresh-turned earth after a rain, but that's exactly what happened on that sweltering day in late July, when the whole Hargrove clan crammed into the parlor of the old farmhouse. The place hadn't changed much since I was a kid running barefoot through the halls, with its worn oak floors that echoed every step and walls papered in faded florals that Grandma had picked out back in the 50s. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slicing through the half-drawn curtains, and the air was thick with the mingle of funeral lilies and the faint, musty tang of history. Mr. Ellis, grandfather's lawyer for as long as I could remember, sat at the head of the room like a judge in his rumpled gray suit, his thin fingers adjusting the stack of papers with the precision of someone who'd seen too many family dramas unfold. He was in his late 70s, with wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his sharp blue eyes, and a voice that carried the gravel of years spent mediating disputes over fences and fortunes. Tom lounged in the chair next to me, his broad shoulders filling out a crisp button-down shirt that cost more than my monthly rent, his dark hair slicked back in that executive style he'd adopted after business school. At 38, he was the golden boy, the one Dad had groomed to take over the family feed empire, with its sprawling warehouses and deals that shipped corn and soy across the Midwest. Me? I was 33, still scraping by in a tiny apartment in Des Moines, working a marketing gig for a local co-op that involved more coffee runs than creative campaigns. I'd shown up in jeans and a simple blouse, my brown hair tied back in a practical ponytail, feeling every bit the outsider in this room full of relatives who'd always treated the farmhouse like a museum piece rather than home. The reading started slow, the way these things do, with bequests to distant cousins and charities that grandfather had supported quietly over the decades. Aunt Clara got the family silver, polished to a shine but gathering dust in a closet somewhere. Uncle Ray, with his weathered face and calloused hands from years helping on the farm, received a modest sum for his retirement, nodding gratefully as if he'd expected nothing more. Then came the big one, the business. Mr. Ellis's voice grew a touch more formal as he announced that the entirety of Hargrove agribusiness, lock, stock, and those gleaming new tractors, went to Thomas Hargrove, my brother. Tom's chest puffed out, and he shot me a sidelong glance, that smirk blooming across his face like he'd just aced a board meeting. The room murmured approval, a few claps even, because everyone knew Tom had been running the day-to-day for years, schmoozing suppliers and closing deals that doubled the revenue. I sat there, stomach twisting as the implications sank in. Dad had passed 2 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving the company in limbo, but grandfather, sharp until his last breath at 92, had the final say. And now, it seemed, I'd drawn the short straw. Mr. Ellis continued, his tone even, to my granddaughter, Emily Hargrove, I bequeath the old farmhouse and its surrounding 5 acres, including all furnishings, livestock, and outbuildings. Livestock? That meant the handful of chickens and the ancient barn cat that grandfather had doted on. The room tittered softly and Tom couldn't hold back. He leaned toward me, his voice low but carrying, enjoy your chickens, Em. Bet those eggs will pair nice with ramen noodles. A chuckle escaped him, drawing laughs from our cousins in the back, the ones who'd always tagged along with him on hunting trips and ignored my invitations to city concerts. Heat flooded my face, a mix of embarrassment and anger, but I swallowed it down, forcing a tight smile. Arguing in front of everyone would just paint me as the sore loser, the sister who couldn't handle a fair shake. Besides, the farmhouse held memories, grandfather teaching me to mend fences, Dad's stories by the fireplace about bootstrapping the business from a single plow. It wasn't nothing, even if it felt like crumbs compared to Tom's feast. The relatives started to shift, gathering purses and murmuring condolences mixed with gossip, when Mr. Ellis cleared his throat again, louder this time, drawing the room back to silence. He peered over his glasses, flipping to the next page with deliberate care. "There is one additional provision regarding the business operations," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make the air feel heavier. Tom's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly, assuming it was some minor clause about taxes or oversight. I held my breath, fingers digging into the armrest, as the lawyer read on. The entirety of the land upon which Hargrove Agribusiness conducts its primary activities, approximately 3,000 acres, including silos, processing facilities, and distribution centers, is owned outright by my granddaughter, Emily Hargrove. This property was deeded to her in a private trust on her 18th birthday, with full authority to lease, sell, or reclaim at her sole discretion. The business's continued operation thereon is contingent upon her approval. The words landed like thunder in a cornfield, silencing the room utterly. I blinked, my mind scrambling back to that birthday 18 years ago, a quiet lunch with grandfather at the diner in town, where he'd slid an envelope across the table and mumbled something about roots running deeper than money. I'd tucked it away, thinking it was just sentiment, maybe a savings bond or a family recipe. But this changed everything. The business, Tom's empire, sat on my land. Without me, it was worthless dirt. Tom's face went white as fresh snow, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure shock that almost made me feel a pang of sympathy if he hadn't just mocked me minutes before. Questions exploded from the crowd. What does that mean? From Aunt Clara, and is this for real? From Uncle Ray. Mr. Ellis raised a hand for calm, explaining that the trust had been airtight, filed quietly to avoid family squabbles, but now it was out in the open. I sat there, heart pounding, as eyes turned to me, not with pity this time, but curiosity, maybe even respect. Tom finally found his voice, sputtering about oversights and appeals, but I met his gaze steadily, the first flicker of power warming my veins. As the meeting broke up in chaos, with handshakes turning awkward and whispers filling the air, I slipped outside to the porch, the cicadas still buzzing, staring at the fields that suddenly felt like mine in a way they never had before. What would Tom do next? And what secrets had grandfather buried in that trust to make this twist so devastating? The uncertainty settled over me like dusk, promising a fight I wasn't sure I wanted, but one I knew was coming. Settling into the old farmhouse after that explosive while reading felt like claiming a throne made of splintered wood and unanswered questions, with the creak of every floorboard reminding me that this place, once dismissed as a backwater relic, now held the keys to Tom's crumbling kingdom. And as I hauled my duffel bags up the sagging porch steps under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, the distant rumble of thunder echoed the storm brewing between us siblings that no amount of family lore could quiet. The first few days blurred into a routine of rediscovery, starting with the kitchen where the ancient Frigidaire hummed like an old friend, stocked with canned goods from grandfather's last shopping trip and a half-empty bottle of whiskey that I eyed but didn't touch, opting instead for strong coffee brewed in a percolator that spat and sputtered as if protesting the intrusion of my city habits into its rural domain, while outside the chickens scratched at the dirt within. Indifference that almost made me envious of their simple existence amid the chaos I'd inherited. Tom didn't waste a beat calling the next morning, his voice crackling over the spotty line as if the miles between the farmhouse and his air-conditioned office amplified his irritation, demanding details about the trust like a banker calling in a loan. But I kept my tone light, describing how I'd already named the lead hen after his ex-wife for good luck, a quip that drew a sharp intake of breath from him followed by a forced chuckle that fooled no one, especially not me as I pictured his knuckles whitening around the receiver in that downtown Des Moines high-rise where deals were sealed with handshakes and spreadsheets rather than sweat and soil. By midweek, The real encroachments began, with Tom's survey crews rolling up in dusty pickups emblazoned with the company logo, their boots trampling the fence line that separated the farmhouse acres from the vast fields that fed his empire. Marking stakes for what they claimed were routine expansions to boost irrigation efficiency, a move that ignored the deeds I'd poured over each night under the dim glow of a bedside lamp. Documents yellowed with age, but crystal clear in asserting my ownership of the underlying earth that propped up his entire operation. I watched from the kitchen window one afternoon, my coffee growing cold as the crew chief, a burly man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense squint, directed his team to probe the soil just inches over the boundary. Their machines whirring like invasive insects that threatened to uproot not just grass, but the fragile balance grandfather had engineered to teach us about legacy's hidden depths, and though anger simmered in my chest like overboiled stew, I held off storming out, knowing a knee-jerk confrontation would play right into Tom's narrative of me as the hot-headed little sister unfit for the big leagues. Instead, I drove into town that evening for supplies, stopping at the county recorder's office where the clerk, a silver-haired woman who'd known our family since Dad's school days, pulled files with a sympathetic nod and confirmed the trust's legitimacy in hushed tones that carried the weight of small-town secrets. Her warnings about potential legal challenges from aggressive kin making my resolve harden even as doubt crept in about whether I should loop in a professional advisor right away or handle this solo to prove my mettle, a choice that felt empowering in the moment, but carried the risky edge of isolation that even I recognized might bite back later. Back at the farmhouse, the rain finally broke, pounding the tin roof like impatient fingers as I unpacked another box from the attic. This one filled with ledgers from the business's early years that detailed how grandfather had outmaneuvered land speculators during the farm crisis of the 80s by quietly acquiring parcels under family names. Entries that hinted at a deliberate strategy to safeguard the core holdings from exactly the kind of corporate overreach Tom now embodied, and as I traced the faded ink with my fingertip, a wry smile tugged at my lips, imagining how he'd squirm if he knew the full extent of these paper trails weaving through our shared history. The family video call Aunt Clara organized that Sunday night provided the perfect stage for my first real jab, with screens flickering to life showing relatives scattered across the state from their cozy living rooms. Tom's face dominating his feed as he boasted about sealing a major contract with a national chain that would double shipments come harvest, his enthusiasm masking the underlying panic I could sense in the way his eyes darted when the land came up. When my turn rolled around, I leaned into the camera with a casual shrug, mentioning offhand how the recent surveys had stirred up some old boundaries that might require a fresh look from surveyors who actually respected deed lines, then added with a twinkle of humor that if Tom's crews kept wandering, they might end up herding my chickens instead of crops, a line that elicited genuine laughs from Uncle Ray and a couple of cousins while Tom's smile froze into something brittle, his quick pivot to weather talk betraying the hit I'd landed without raising my voice, a satisfying mini-revenge that reaffirmed my leverage even as it escalated the unspoken war. As the call wrapped with awkward goodnights, I retreated to the attic once more, the storm outside mirroring the one inside my thoughts, and that's when I unearthed the sealed envelope tucked into the rafters. Its wax seal intact and addressed in grandfather's unmistakable script to me alone. The weight of it in my palm stirring a cocktail of curiosity and trepidation, because whatever pact or revelation lay within could either solidify my claim or unleash a family fracture deeper than any fault line in Iowa's fertile plains, leaving me to stare at it long into the night, the house settling around me with creaks that whispered of secrets waiting to spill. Prying open that sealed envelope in the dim attic light felt like cracking the spine of a forbidden book, the paper yielding with a soft rip that echoed my growing unease about the tangled web grandfather had woven. And as I unfolded the pages under the single bare bulb swinging like a pendulum, the words jumped out in his looping handwriting detailing a pact from Dad's younger days. One where he'd promised to keep the land trust hidden to shield it from creditors during a rough patch in the '80s when the farm crisis nearly swallowed the business whole, a revelation that painted Tom not just as the smug heir but potentially complicit in overlooking, or worse, burying clues that could have balanced the scales long ago. Leaving me with a knot in my gut that tightened as I realized this document alone might force a reckoning, but also expose fractures in our family I'd rather leave mended. The next morning dawned crisp with the scent of turned soil wafting through the open windows, but my peace was short-lived as reports from neighbors trickled in about Tom's crews pushing further, now installing drainage pipes that snaked across disputed lines under the guise of flood prevention. Their excavators churning up earth that belonged to me and stirring a dust cloud visible from the farmhouse porch like a taunt from across the fields, prompting me to grab the keys to my truck and head straight for his office, without a second thought to consulting anyone. A impulsive decision born of frustration that I knew deep down was playing with fire, since going in solo meant no witnesses to his inevitable spin, but felt like the only way to stare down the bully he'd become without handing him the narrative of weakness. The drive into Des Moines blurred by in a haze of golden cornstalks bowing under the autumn breeze, my mind replaying snippets from the envelope about how Dad had once confided in Grandfather about Tom's early ambitions bordering on ruthless, a hint that made my resolve steel even as doubt nagged at whether confronting him alone would yield truth or just more bluster from the brother who'd always talked his way out of chores back on the farm. I burst into his corner office unannounced, the receptionist barely getting a word out before I was past her desk and through the frosted glass door, where Tom sat amid stacks of contracts and a model silo gleaming on his shelf, his surprise morphing into that familiar patronizing grin as he gestured to a chair like I was a client pitching a bad idea rather than family demanding respect for boundaries. "Emily, to what do I owe the pleasure?" he drawled, leaning back in his leather throne, but I cut straight to it, slapping a photocopy of the deed excerpt on his desk and recounting the latest border breach with details sharp as a scythe. Watching his eyes flick to the paper before dismissing it as outdated bureaucracy that a simple lease renewal could fix, his offer to cut me a check for the hassle laced with the implication that I was out of my depth in this corporate arena where I'd always been the tag-along. The argument heated up when he brought up our shared childhood, twisting memories of me tagging along on his adventures into proof that the business was his birthright while the farmhouse suited my so-called simpler tastes. A low blow that had me seeing red and nearly walking out, but instead I leaned in with a sly counter, mentioning off the cuff how a quick chat with the county assessor had uncovered some interesting liens from those crisis years that might complicate his expansions if not cleared by the true owner, a half-bluff drawn from the envelope's clues that landed with enough ambiguity to make him pause and probe for sources, giving me the satisfaction of stonewalling him with a wink and the line that some dirt is best left unturned unless you're the one holding the shovel, my words carrying just enough humor to deflate his bluster without escalating to shouts, a witty parry. That bought me time even as it painted a target on my back for whatever retaliation he cooked up next. Driving home with the sun dipping low and casting long shadows over the highway, I felt a fleeting high from the exchange, but it soured when I pulled into the driveway and found Cousin Lila waiting on the porch steps, her pickup truck idling with a thermos of what she claimed was peace-offering soup, her warm smile and tales of farm life pulling me into a conversation where I let slip more about the pact than I intended, trusting her bond from our girlhood days braiding hay in the barn despite the nagging voice in my head warning that blood ties in business often bent under pressure. We spent the afternoon in the kitchen, her laughter filling the space as she helped sort through more attic relics, uncovering a faded photo of Dad and Tom as boys standing on what looked like the contested acreage. But as she lingered over the envelope's copy I'd left out, her questions grew pointed. About timelines and potential shares for extended family, a subtle shift that planted the seed of unease when she mentioned casually how Tom had been asking around about my plans, her reassurance ringing a touch too eager and making me question if my choice to confide without safeguards had handed her, or through her, him, ammunition to undermine my stand. The evening brought a brief respite with a walk through the cooling fields, the chickens settling into their coop with contented clucks that mocked the turmoil in my chest, but as twilight deepened, My phone lit up with an email from an unfamiliar law firm attached to Tom's company, the subject line reading Notice of Intent to Contest Trust Validity. Its contents outlining preliminary claims of undue influence on grandfather and forged documents that could tie me up in court for months. A legal salvo that hit like a sucker punch and left me pacing the creaky floors, staring at the envelope's pages, now feeling less like armor and more like a fuse to a powder keg, wondering if Lila's visit had been coincidence or the first whisper of betrayal from within the fold that would force me to fight not just Tom, but the very family I'd hoped to reclaim. That notice of intent to contest the trust validity sat on my kitchen table like a venomous snake, coiled and waiting, its formal language weaving a net of doubt around the solid ground I'd started to claim. And though the smart move would have been to fire off an email to a lawyer right then to counter Tom's opening salvo, I hesitated, wrestling with the stubborn notion that involving outsiders too soon might dilute the personal edge of this fight, a choice that left me isolated in the farmhouse's echoing quiet, and one I could already sense the family would shake their heads at if they knew, preferring instead to lean on the extended kin who'd always mediated our squabbles back when we were kids fighting over the last slice of pie at holiday gatherings. The days stretched into a tense standoff, with Tom's crews halting their incursions, but leaving behind half-buried stakes like territorial markers that mocked my every glance out the window, and whispers from town reached me through the feed store grapevine about how he was rallying investors with tales of a smooth transition now that the land hiccup was being ironed out legally. A spin that painted me as the unreasonable holdout disrupting progress in a community where farms meant livelihoods and loyalty ran as deep as the topsoil. Desperation nudged me toward the annual harvest dinner that weekend, the Hargrove tradition held in the old community hall with its vaulted beams and long oak tables that had hosted generations of feasts, where the air would fill with the aromas of slow-roasted pork and apple cider mulled with cinnamon, a setting ripe for airing grievances under the guise of unity, and I decided to go not just to eat, but to sway the uncles and aunts who held sway in local circles, confiding selectively about the notice to build quiet support against Tom's machinations, an emotional gamble that felt like reclaiming family bonds, but carried the risk of fracturing them further if loyalties split along bloodlines. The hall buzzed with arrivals as dusk settled, lanterns strung along the rafters casting a warm glow over faces weathered by seasons of plenty and lean, and I wove through the crowd greeting cousins with hugs that masked my nerves, eventually cornering Uncle Ray near the dessert table where he ladled punch into plastic cups, his broad frame still sturdy from years of baling hay before retiring to a quieter plot. And as I shared the envelope's packed details in low tones amid the clatter of silverware, his nod of understanding and promise to speak with other elders gave me a spark of hope. Even as Aunt Clara hovered nearby with her sharp ears catching fragments that made her brow furrow in that way, signaling she'd relay it straight to Tom for the sake of so-called harmony. Dinner commenced with grace said over steaming platters, the conversation flowing like the river that bordered our lands, but tension simmered beneath the surface until Tom rose for his toast, glass raised high as he praised the harvest's bounty and the business's bright future, his words slickly skirting the land issue while implying that family disputes were just growing pains best resolved privately. A veiled dig that had several relatives glancing my way with sympathetic smiles that bordered on pity, prompting me to stand in response with a plate still half full and counter his optimism by recounting a light-hearted anecdote from grandfather's days about outfoxing a nosy inspector by relocating a boundary marker under cover of night, framing it as a lesson in creative stewardship that drew chuckles from the table and a few approving murmurs from the older crowd who remembered those scrappy times. My delivery laced with enough wry humor to underscore that true legacy lay in the dirt, not the dollars, a clever mini-revenge that chipped at Tom's facade without outright accusation and left him gripping his fork a tad too tightly as he forced a laugh. The evening unraveled subtly after that, with Lila pulling me aside during cleanup to admit under the hum of dishwashers that she'd shared my confidences with Tom in a moment of weakness, believing it would prompt negotiation rather than escalation. Her tearful apology twisting the knife of my earlier trust in her and making me regret the choice to involve the family web so deeply when it now felt like a snare closing around my independence. A backfire that isolated me further as whispers turned to sidelong stares and Uncle Ray's earlier support evaporated into vague promises when pressed later by the group. Driving back through the misty night with the hall's lights fading in my rearview, the radio droning farm reports of yields down due to dry spells that mirrored my parched alliances. I mulled over the night's revelations, including a snippet from Aunt Clara about Dad's old land swap during the crisis that involved shady loans from out-of-state bankers, a clue that deepened the envelope's shadows and hinted at vulnerabilities Tom might exploit if he dug deep enough, but before I could process it fully, my phone vibrated with a terse voicemail from Mr. Ellis the lawyer. His voice grave as he mentioned an urgent summons to a mediation session at the county courthouse the following week, initiated by Tom's firm and loaded with implications of injunctions that could freeze my rights pending review. A development that slammed the brakes on my thoughts and left me pulling over on the shoulder headlights, cutting through the fog as the weight of impending courtroom battles settled like frost on the windshield, bracing for a showdown where every buried secret might surface to either vindicate or vanquish me in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The mediation session at the county courthouse loomed like a thunderhead on the horizon, its sterile conference room with scuffed linoleum and buzzing fluorescence a far cry from the open fields I'd grown to cherish. And as I gathered my stack of documents, including that pivotal envelope and the cassette tape unearthed from Grandfather's desk drawer during a final attic sweep, I wrestled with the lingering regret of my solitary path through this mess. A series of choices that had left me without a legal ally at my side and now facing Tom's phalanx of suited attorneys who could twist words like vines around a trellis, yet in the quiet drive there with the radio murmuring crop futures. A defiant spark ignited from knowing I'd relied on grit over guidance, even if it meant walking into the lion's den with nothing but family history as my shield. The room filled early with the scent of stale coffee and tension thick enough to chew, Tom at the head of his side flanked by two sharp-faced lawyers from a Des Moines firm known for burying small farmers under paperwork, their briefcases snapping open to reveal color-coded files that screamed preparation, while Mr. Ellis sat beside me as a neutral observer at my insistence. His presence a small concession to sense that I hoped wouldn't undermine my independent stance, but provided at least a familiar face amid the strangers. Proceedings kicked off with Tom's lead counsel laying out their case in measured tones, arguing the trust's creation stemmed from Grandfather's senility and undue pressure from me during those late visits, bolstered by affidavits from nurses and a dubious timeline that conveniently omitted the 18th birthday deed, a narrative designed to portray me as the manipulative granddaughter angling for a windfall. And though Tom's eyes met mine with a flicker of triumph that recalled his will reading smirk, I held steady, the audience in my head, those relatives who'd wavered at the harvest dinner, urging me to counter without crumbling under the weight of their polished assault. When my turn came, I rose slowly, channeling the steady rhythm of planting seasons as I presented the envelopes packed verbatim, its pages detailing Dad's desperate land swap in the 80s not as a clean deal, but one laced with off-the-books loans from shadowy lenders that Tom had later refinanced without full disclosure, a bombshell pulled from the cassette's crackling audio where Dad's voice, frail but clear, confessed to Grandfather about covering for his son's shortcuts to keep the business afloat, revelations that made the opposing counsel shift uncomfortably and drew a sharp intake from Tom, his face paling as the room absorbed how his empire rested on foundations cracked by those very omissions. The twist deepened when Lila burst in midway, breathless from the drive and clutching a folder of her own, her redemption arc unfolding as she testified to overhearing Tom's private calls pressuring her for dirt on my findings, documents she'd secretly copied from his office files showing inflated valuations to lure investors while downplaying the land risks, a bold move born from guilt over her earlier betrayal that I'd foolishly enabled by confiding too freely, leaving even me to question if such leaps of faith in flawed family were heroic or just another layer of the chaos we'd inherited, her words landing like rain on parched earth and tipping the mediator towards skepticism of Tom's claims. As negotiations dragged into the afternoon with breaks for whispered huddles and cooling tempers, I seized the moment for my final play. Proposing not outright seizure, but a restructured lease where I'd retain veto power on expansions and redirect a portion of profits to community soil conservation, framing it with a humorous aside about how grandfather always said the best deals planted seeds for tomorrow rather than reaping all today, a witty clause that forced Tom to concede board oversight to me while exposing his regulatory skirts to potential audits if he pushed back. The satisfaction of watching him sign with a jaw clenched tighter than a rusted gate hinge washing over me like the first warm day after winter. A layered revenge that stripped his unchecked reign without total destruction, yet bound him to accountability in ways his arrogance had never anticipated. Victory tasted bittersweet as we filed out into the fading light, the courthouse steps echoing with handshakes that felt more like truces than triumphs. And driving back to the farmhouse with the cassette safely stowed and Lila's tentative offer of alliance hanging in the air, I reflected on the costs of my headstrong choices, the alienated kin, the sleepless nights chasing ghosts in the attic. That had nearly cost me everything but ultimately forged a harder resolve, though unanswered shadows lingered like fog over the fields about Dad's full complicity in that swap and whether grandfather's trust hid one last secret pact designed to test our worthiness beyond wealth. Pulling into the driveway as stars pricked the twilight sky, the chickens scratching contentedly in their run, I sat for a moment with the engine idling, pondering if inheritance was ever truly about the land or the lessons it unearthed. The ambiguities of greed and loyalty weaving a tapestry that bound us tighter than any deed, leaving the future as open and unpredictable as the next harvest, where forgiveness might bloom or bitterness take root, a question mark etched into the horizon that invited endless rumination on what we'd truly passed down through the generations.